This is Camp Countdown, a Toronto Maple Leafs podcast series. I'm your host, Kyle Cushman, and on today's show, we're diving into the fascinating case that is Matt Murray, back with the Maple Leafs on a one-year, $875,000 contract. Of course, Matt Murray basically didn't play last season. He underwent bilateral hip surgery in the offseason last year, was on LTIR for essentially the entire season, or he was on LTIR for the entire season and went on a conditioning stint to finish off the year with the Toronto Marlies. He played 3 games at the kind of middle to end point of April. He won his debut in the shootout, allowing 5 goals on 27 shots, and lost his 2 other starts, allowing 3 goals on 27 shots against Rochester, and his final game, allowing 4 goals on 24 shots against Cleveland. That results in an .846 save percentage and a 4.03 goals against average in 3 starts to finish the season with the Marlies. And all of that to say, none of those stats matter whatsoever. You're talking about a 30-year-old goaltender, or I guess 29 at the time, that was coming off of major surgery, had not played the entire season, and was getting 3 random games leading into the playoff stretch for the American League, going in cold versus teams that are heating up, getting ready for the playoffs. 2 extremely different situations there, and I don't think that those 3 games are an indication of where Murray's game's at. I don't think that those 3 games should impact your opinion on Matt Murray whatsoever. Those games were literally just for Matt Murray, and I believe his confidence to believe in his body to go out there and be like, yeah, I can do this again, instead of having to experience that in training camp this year. Going back the year prior, Murray played 26 games with the Maple Leafs in his first season with the team, had a .903 save percentage and 14 wins in those 26 games. He was banged up at the end of the season, didn't really play at the end of the campaign, and eventually was dressed as a backup as necessary in the playoffs, but I don't think anyone really saw him as a legitimate option to play. You look at his play down the stretch that season, and it wasn't particularly good. And this kind of goes back to the never-ending question mark that is the health of Matt Murray. It's been the major question mark for the past 5-6 years of his career, and it will be that until he proves that those are behind him, if they will ever be behind him. You look at that final stretch of the season, going from January onwards with the Maple Leafs there. In 12 games at the back half, or I guess I should say the start of 2023, in the back half of that 22-23 season, the only season that he's played with the Maple Leafs, he played 12 games, went 5-5, and had an .881 save percentage. You look at the first half of the season, or I guess I should say the unofficial first half of the season, before the turn of the calendar in 2022, in 14 games, he had 9 wins and a .920 save percentage. It was a complete flip after kind of the first handful of games for Matt Murray in that second half of the season. He gets injured in the middle, or he gets injured basically the first week of the season, comes back in November, plays a little bit the next couple of months, gets injured again in mid-January, comes back in March, and then, as we know, wasn't really available at the end of the season in the playoffs. It was the concern when the Maple Leafs acquired Matt Murray. At the time, they got a sweetener and got a little bit of salary retention from Ottawa. It was very much a Kyle Dubas type play of a guy that he has belief in, going back to the Sault Ste. Marie Greyhounds days. At the time, the top goaltender evaluator in the Maple Leafs organization, John Elkin, had a lot of experience with Matt Murray dating back to his kind of beginning stages with the Sault Ste. Marie Greyhounds, and before that as well. And so at the time, he had 2 people in the Leafs organization that had experience with Murray, that really trusted him as a goaltender and believed in his ability to take the flyer on him at a bloated cap hit, get a pick with that as well, and kind of see how it played out. It was a risky move at the time. It didn't really end up biting the Leafs because they got Ilya Samsonov. He played perfectly good in that first season with the Leafs, and Matt Murray's contract didn't affect the team last year because he was on long-term injured reserve. So even though the move obviously didn't pan out for the Maple Leafs, it was a move that didn't really hinder the team all that much, looking at how things played out. Looking at the couple of picks that the team got in that trade, they got a 3rd round pick and a 7th round pick in addition to Matt Murray in that trade for just taking on his contract. The 3rd round pick was included in the trade to get Noel Acciari and Ryan O'Reilly in 2023. And that 7th round pick, the team used this year to draft Matt Leahy. So definitely a situation where if Matt Leahy ever pans out, which the odds are very much against him as a 7th round pick out of the BCHL, is pretty much just Matt Murray that we're talking about in that trade. So I guess the conversation for Matt Murray before we kind of get to why he's a goaltender worth keeping around is, well, I guess it kind of goes with this conversation is why would the team re-sign him? It's not the same general manager. John Elkin left to the Pittsburgh Penguins. So the top goaltender evaluator with the team is Curtis McElhinney now, who I don't believe has any crossover with Matt Murray. The new general manager, Brad Treliving, who has no crossover, to my knowledge, in the past with Matt Murray. So why would the team keep him around? Why wouldn't they just say, thanks, but no thanks. Thanks for the service. We hope you get well. We'll see you down the road. We wish you the best. Looking at his experience, and I guess it is good to get to this point now. If Matt Murray is legitimately healthy and comes into the season, it's tough to think of a 3rd string goaltender that you can sneak through waivers that would be a better fit than Matt Murray in this situation. You had Martin Jones last year, who had played legitimate NHL minutes. You were able to get him through waivers through a little bit of sneaky signing bonus stuff. And he was perfectly fine in his role. Would you sneak Martin Jones through waivers again? I might lean yes, and that might have been a better fit there. But at the same time, for Martin Jones, who at the time remains without a contract, do you really want to do that again? Go through waivers, deal with the AHL stuff, and then come up and play in the NHL? Or would you rather find a team or a role where you kind of know more what you're going to have? Maybe that's part of the reason why he's still unsigned. So for Matt Murray, he's somebody that the team has spent a lot of time with the past 2 years, kind of rehabbing him through this surgery the past year and kind of wanting to see what he can do and give him the opportunity to. So I can see that element. But I also think him likely being on the Toronto Marlies roster, it's tough to think of a better goaltender to have there as a mentor for young goaltenders than Matt Murray. You're talking about a 2-time Stanley Cup champion right out of the gate of his NHL career. Somebody that has played for Canada at the World Championship, somebody that has played at the World Cup for Team North America, somebody that has played alongside future Hall of Famer in Marc-Andre Fleury, but at the same time has also gone through significant injury struggles, has gone through a tough end to his situation in Pittsburgh, has gone through a tough entire tenure with the Ottawa Senators, comes to the Maple Leafs, and again, struggles with the injuries, and ultimately doesn't really finish out his long-term contract extension the way that he anticipated it would. There's a lot of good to have in Matt Murray around guys like Dennis Hildeby, Artur Akhtiamov, whoever else ends up being around the Marlies roster in kind of the goaltending situation. Because somebody like Matt Murray has undergone those kind of significant injury issues. And it's not just the hips. There's been a lot of other issues for Matt Murray. And you look at another big goaltender in Dennis Hildeby, who's listed at 6'7", Matt Murray listed at 6'4". Dennis Hildeby underwent hip surgery when he was like 20 years old. And that's more of a preventative surgery going forwards than it is kind of repairing all of the wear and tear versus a 30-year-old getting that surgery, or 29-year-old at the time, and a 20-year-old. But there's a lot of, I don't want to say similarities, but a lot of crossover experience for those two players that I think could help not just Dennis Hildeby having that kind of presence around him to help him, but also for Matt Murray as well, to see what this young kid has done at his size, going through I don't want to say similar surgery because I'm not a doctor. I don't know the specifics of it, but undergoing a hip procedure and seeing him kind of flourish afterwards as well. Ultimately, it's a long shot that Matt Murray becomes anybody of note with the Maple Leafs roster this season. You're talking about, at best, the third string option coming off of a season that he didn't play at all, and the games he did play, as I mentioned, weren't particularly good. He hasn't played kind of consistently well in the NHL since that opening stint to the 22-23 season, which is now 2 years ago, which I know is insane to think about, and has not played well over an entire NHL season since 2018-19, when he had a .919 save percentage in 50 games with the Pittsburgh Penguins. You're talking about the year removed from the Penguins' back-to-back Stanley Cups. Or, sorry, the 2 seasons removed from the Penguins' back-to-back Stanley Cups there. So it's a long shot that Murray is healthy, just given the situation. Odds are he's going to get banged up at some point and won't really be a factor. But if he stays healthy, there's enough there to make you think that he's a worthwhile gamble on a cheap contract after spending a lot of time with him the past couple of seasons, and see what he can do in the American League as a mentor for your up-and-coming goaltending prospects. I really hope we see Matt Murray have a healthy season and get back to the NHL level. This is a guy that has gone through a lot the past handful of years and is still only 30 years old. It's crazy. Matt Murray has been around forever. It feels like he's 35, the way that some people talk about him, because he came into the NHL and won the Stanley Cup right away as a rookie, and then won it again as a rookie. Matt Murray is a fascinating case to look back at, given how he burst onto the scene with the Penguins, but also when he was drafted in 2012, he did not have a good season with Sault Ste. Marie, had an .876 save percentage. The season afterwards, he did not have a great season with Sault Ste. Marie. He had an .894 save percentage. And then everything clicked with Sault Ste. Marie the year afterwards. He had a .921 save percentage. The year after that, he's playing amazingly in the AHL with a .941 save percentage with Wilkes-Barre. And the year after that, he's winning the Stanley Cup. That's an example of not really believing in goaltending numbers at the junior level and just kind of seeing the raw talent and seeing the ability and developing that talent. There's a lot to take away from Matt Murray's career, as I mentioned, going back to those junior days, how he burst onto the scene, and kind of how things have fallen apart for him in recent years. I'm rooting for Matt Murray. I hope we see him in the preseason. I hope he plays well in the preseason. I hope he gets cheered in the preseason, just given everything he's gone through. It would be really, really cool to see that as a success story this season, because the Leafs have 2 fairly inexperienced goaltenders on the NHL roster. You look at Joseph Woll, who has dealt with some injury woes. Of course, you think back to Game 7 as an example. Pretty big one that he missed due to injury. Has not played over 30 games, ever. Looking back to 2019-20, that's the only time he's done it as a pro. 2020-21, only played the 15 games in that weird COVID year. Season after that, played 19 games total across the 2 levels. Season after that, he plays 28 regular season games and adds 5 in the playoffs. So there's an example that you could potentially look to. And then last season, he plays 28 games in the NHL across the regular season and playoffs, and had 1 game with the Marlies on a conditioning stint as well. You're talking about a goaltender that you're hoping can step into that starting role and play 40 plus games plus an extended run in the playoffs. He's not shown the ability to do that so far in his career, partially due to injuries, partially due to opportunity as well. We'll see if that's something that Joseph Woll can do. If he can't, that opens a door for somebody like Matt Murray to step into if he's having a good season with the Marlies. Anthony Stolarz is 30 years old. He's actually older than Matt Murray, which is crazy to think about, given the fact that Anthony Stolarz has never played a starting role in the NHL. He's consistently been a really good backup option, played 28 games with Anaheim in 21-22 and had a .917 save percentage on that team. Played 27 games last season with the Florida Panthers, and we'll dive more into Stolarz as well coming up on Camp Countdown. But those are 2 goaltenders that have not played a legitimate starting role in the NHL. Somebody's got to do it this upcoming season. I think one of those 2 goaltenders can take that role. But if somebody doesn't, and if somebody gets hurt, you're going to be calling on somebody to come up to the NHL roster. It could be Dennis Hildeby, who gets that recall as your top goaltending prospect, depending on how he starts the season with the Marlies. And he is a little bit older. He's already going to be 23 years old for this upcoming season, so you feel at least somewhat okay that you're not rushing a goaltender straight to the NHL roster. It could just as easily be Matt Murray getting that recall. And I think the team probably hopes it's Matt Murray going to be that guy that gets that recall and they can leave Hildeby to be the guy with the Marlies and not disrupt his season. I'm hopeful for Murray, but ultimately I don't think it's likely that we see him kind of break into the NHL lineup, have any kind of impact of note, and ultimately is kind of that 1B to back up to third string option with the Marlies, depending on how they want to use Artur Akhtiamov, in addition to Dennis Hildeby as kind of the clear-cut starter. He's a guy I'm going to be rooting for. The personal stuff he's gone through in recent years, the mental struggles that come with significant injuries and kind of the uncertainty of having your career potentially taken away from you. The fact that he's even healthy enough to sign an NHL contract on July 1st, play at the end of last season, and have a full training leading into this season where he's going to probably get action in the preseason. He's going to play with the Marlies if he clears waivers. I'm hopeful for Matt Murray that he can land on his feet this year, and at the very least can have a healthy season where he plays most of the campaign, is available for most of the campaign, even if that is at the American League level. Very excited to get to my conversation now with Evan Doerfler, one of the up-and-comers in the space, currently with the Hockey News, to chat about Matt Murray, his recent podcast appearance on Slang and the Biscuit, where he kind of detailed some of the struggles that he went through recently in terms of the hip issues and kind of his recovery, and leading into this season, expectations for Matt Murray and what we could see from him. Very excited to be joined now by Evan Doerfler. Evan, thanks for jumping on here.
Yeah, Kyle, thanks for having me. And yeah, look forward to it.
Yeah, so we're chatting about Matt Murray today, and you wrote a great recap of his appearance on the Slang and the Biscuit podcast for the Hockey News recently. And so I think it's best to kind of start with this summer and then kind of maybe jump around a little bit over his career with the Leafs and kind of his career kind of in general. He re-signs on a 1-year, $875,000 contract. Just given the injury issues and everything that he's dealt with the last couple of years, I didn't really know whether to expect him to sign an NHL contract at all, if it would be in Toronto, if he did. A lot of different factors. I actually kind of thought that he might end up back in Pittsburgh for a bunch of different reasons. Ultimately, he does re-sign with Toronto. Going into the summer, did you expect Murray to remain with the organization, or were you a little bit surprised, like I was, that he did end up coming back?
Yeah, Kyle, and I think Matt had some options. I don't think Toronto was the only option he had, and kind of like you and like most Leaf fans and those covering the Leafs, we weren't really sure what the Leafs goaltending situation was going to look like after July 1st and heading into the fall. Just because, we know the injury history, even with Joseph Wall, for example, and the limited playing time that Stolarz has seen. And, it was a question mark, a big one, actually, heading to free agency as to how they were going to address their crease, right? Like, we didn't know if it was going to be sustainable, if they had those two. And so I think by bringing back Murray, and obviously, as the story goes, is that this is the best that he's looked. They're hoping that he may be able to fill that void, kind of as Martin Jones did last year when they had Samsonov dealing with his struggles and Joseph Wall with injuries. And so I think the deal, and Murray said himself, it's kind of like a prove it deal, and he wants to see if he can still do it, if he still has it. And I think ultimately he liked his time in Toronto. He's liked it so far, and I don't think he felt that he had given the organization a fair shake. I mean, he's really only played in, I think, 26 games in the NHL for the Leafs. And so I think this was just a deal that's going to be, we'll see what he has kind of thing. And they're hoping he can maybe fill that third goaltending role.
Yeah, plays 26 games for the Leafs that first year he was with Toronto. Had pretty decent numbers across the board, a .903 save percentage. Nothing fantastic, but considering that he was waived the previous year by Ottawa and had really struggled the last couple of years before that, it was a relatively fine season where Ilya Samsonov takes the role, Joseph Woll looks good in a few spots, and Murray eventually does kind of go by the wayside just due to some injuries and dresses in the playoffs, but that's a couple years in the past now. The main thing is that last summer he underwent successful bilateral hip surgery, which is a very big surgery to go under at 30 years old, which he is now going into this season.
Yeah.
Missed the entire season for the most part. He did come back at the very end of the season, but taking into account just how big of a surgery he went under, kind of what were your thoughts on Murray over the past year? Did you think that he would be coming back and looking to make that push to play NHL games again, just considering he was on LTIR and there was a bit of a sense that that could have been the end of his career?
Yeah, there was for sure, Kyle. And I wasn't entirely sure, as were, a lot of people. Obviously, this is a major surgery. I mean, there's no dancing around it. This is a major surgery, especially at 30 years old. I mean, he's got a lot of traction on those tires. So I wasn't entirely sure what the future maybe looked like for him. If there was going to be a deal in place, I assumed it was going to be one kind of along the lines as to what he had gotten. And just like based on what you had mentioned, he did. I think it's good that he was able to get in some reps last year with the Marlies. I think he played in 3 games, and not that the numbers were anything extraordinary, but he hadn't played for. He was out 6 to 8 months. It helps give people a look at as to what he could maybe still do. And then obviously he had the entire summer to recover, and so I think that also helped. And he even mentioned himself, like during the recovery process, it was he was working week to week with the facilities, roster and staff, and with the Leafs specifically. And so, I think he was back on the ice for the first time around 4 months post surgery, and then 5 months post surgery is when he actually started to wear goalie gear. And he even said himself, actually, I think it took him a couple weeks to kind of relearn his movements and start taking shots. And so, I wasn't entirely sure if teams were going to be willing, but I think he said himself that there were actually a handful of teams that were interested in him aside from just the Leafs. And he also mentioned that he wasn't a diehard Leafs fan growing up by any means, but obviously being from Ontario, Thunder Bay, his father, I think, was a fan of the team, and his first ever NHL game was watching the Leafs. So if there was going to be a team, and like I said before, I don't think he felt he's had a fair opportunity. It was going to be the Leafs.
Yeah, those 3 games at the end of the Marley season is almost like an impossible situation for a goalie to go in, not playing any games the entire year previous to that, going in after major surgery. So trying to regain that trust in your body as well. And also doing that at the end of a season when the teams that you're playing against are all gearing up for the playoffs. So I do think that those numbers at the end of the AHL season are very much numbers to not pay attention to other than the games played total. The fact that he played games
Right.
at the end of last season, I think, is really huge for him and is great for him coming into this season because he has that experience at the end
Hmm.
of last season. He got to play those handful of games. It's not coming into camp this year and being like, what's my body going to feel like when I'm actually in a game? He knows
Right.
what that was like. And now he can go into this season and actually properly prepare from training camp onwards, which I think is a great thing for him as well. I
Yeah.
mentioned earlier that you wrote that great recap of Murray's really great podcast appearance with the Slang in the Bit podcast. What were some of the key things that you learned listening through that episode? What were some of the big takeaways that you had from going through that episode with Murray?
I mean, I think the biggest thing for me, he said, was that he's kind of been dealing with significant hip pain since his days with the Scranton Penguins when he was like 20 years old. And even just with the Leafs, he's had significant setbacks, abductor, ankle, concussion injury, back in 2023. Like just the amount of pain that maybe he had played through, over those 10 years, from 20 to where he is 30 now. I just found it fascinating considering everything he's done, 2 time Stanley Cup champion with the Pittsburgh Penguins. And then obviously having like a very, very good career to this point. I just thought that it was, I mean, that's probably one thing that stuck out to me. And then I'd say the other thing too is just more so the recovery process. I always like hearing these stories as to, how these professional athletes, come back recovery and come back to hopefully the form that they were before they were injured. Because at the end of the day, they are human beings and, they're not just players. And so I understand that the recovery process could be one that's brutal. And for something like this at age 30, the bilateral hip surgery, and especially as a goalie, I mean, the hips, like he mentioned himself, how it kind of connects everything. I mentioned those injuries. And he was saying, he said he had the lower back issues and the ankle injuries, and he felt that there was something stemming from that. And, I'd like to believe that this is what it was. And so, being back on the ice for the first time, it took 4 months to get back to that point. He was working week by week, but just imagine from their perspective, going through this type of injury where you're going to be out for the season before it even starts. And, it's a long process. So I was interested to hear as to how that whole process went.
Yeah, certainly. It's something where, man, you look at Murray's career and it started so promising. And the first handful of years that he had in Pittsburgh, it looked like he was going to be an elite goaltender for a very long time. And partially due to the injuries and everything that happened later on in his career, it's just kind of fallen apart the last handful of years. And so, yeah, like I think a lot of people are cheering for Murray to get back to at least some kind of form. Obviously, he's not going to be the 923 Stanley Cup winning goaltender that he was.
Right.
He was like 23 years old. That the odds of that happening are very, very unlikely.
Yeah.
But going into his early 30s here, if he can get back to being an NHL caliber goaltender after missing so much time the last handful of years due to these major injuries, that would be an awesome, awesome story. So I think a lot of people are pulling for Murray and are excited to see what he can do in training camp coming up here, because we are probably going to see Murray get into some preseason action just because he is one of those veteran goaltenders. So he counts towards the veteran total for the preseason games. That matters for certain teams and getting players in and kind of the roster, um, how the rosters go for each preseason game. And the Leafs don't necessarily have a lot of goaltenders on the roster either in terms of getting other guys starts in addition to Wool, Stolars, Hildeby, and a couple other goaltenders as well. So coming up into training camp now, what is kind of the goal for Matt Murray this season? What do you see as a successful season for Matt Murray being? I know it's a bit of a weird one because he's been in the NHL for so long, but we expect him to be with the Marlies just because of the current roster construction.
Right.
What would you say is the goal for Matt Murray for this season?
Yeah, for Matt, I mean, I would honestly just say, I mean, kind of what we've been talking about. The reps are going to be the biggest thing for me and for himself as well. I mean, this is like a prove it year type thing. And, as poor as it might be, just because he's coming off of such a major surgery and, like you said, maybe not the highest of expectations, but, at the end of the day, it is, the NHL, the AHL. And like you said, there are goalies in the system. It's a unique spot to be in for sure. And so, the expectations, I think, are just to see what he has and to prove himself. If he is capable of playing, a decent amount of games and appearances and doing well in those performances and proving that he still has it, I think that would probably be the number one thing. I'm not by any means expecting him to be, posting numbers that he was when he was with Pittsburgh, in those Stanley Cup winning years, for example. But if he could get in, get the reps in, and prove that he has something that could be of use for the Leafs, I mean, that would just be, I mean, that's exactly, I think, what they're looking for.
Yeah, I think there's a couple ways to kind of look at this where the obviously I think the big goal is that he can stay healthy, obviously, for the full season, can establish himself as a legitimate goaltending option again, and be the Leafs' number three goaltender this season, and
Right.
allow the younger guys to just stay with the Marlies the whole season. Because last year we saw, due to some injury issues, Dennis Hildeby have to come up and back up for a couple games on the road. That's
Yeah.
probably not a situation that you love having a goaltender like that in, especially if another injury happens and all of a sudden you have to throw a young goaltender into the lineup. If Matt
Hmm.
Murray can be that third string guy that dresses on those kind of games where you need a goaltender, I think that would be a big boost as well. And part of it as well is you go back in Murray's history, and the last time that he had kind of I think what you would characterize as a successful season was his second last year in Pittsburgh in 2018-19 when he had a 919 save percentage, played for Canada at the World Championships. After that point, he'd been at a sub 900 goaltender in the NHL and had played some stints in the AHL as well. So going back that far since being kind of that quote unquote successful goaltender in the NHL as well, I think there's also a lot of experience that he can lend and help kind of tutor some of the younger goaltenders if
Right.
he is on the Marlies roster as well. And just talking about Dennis Hildeby, when before he was drafted, underwent not the same surgery. I'm not certain on the specifics of it, but he went under double hip surgery as well at a young age. Obviously, recovering from that kind of procedure at like 20 years old is very different than 30 years
Right.
old. But
Yeah.
there is some kind of similarities between the two in terms of working together and kind of learning from each other. So
Right.
there's a couple angles to look at it for sure. When I look at kind of the quote unquote goal for Matt Murray this year, there's a
Hmm.
lot that he could potentially help the actual Maple Leafs roster in and being that sturdy number 3 option if he can stay healthy and kind of establish that role. But also there's the kind of mentorship aspect. And you're
Yeah, for
talking
sure.
about a 2-time Stanley Cup winner, has played at the World Cup, has played at the World Championships, has been in that limelight in Pittsburgh and in Ottawa, and obviously in Toronto, has dealt with personal struggles, has looked to overcome some of those as well. If you're talking about like a veteran goaltender to have on an AHL roster and help teach some of these young goaltenders as well, Matt Murray seems like a very, very good guy to have in that kind of role as well. And so going ahead now and looking to this season as we wrap up here, it's kind of a simple question, but I think it's also a difficult one as well. Just
Yeah.
simply, do we see Matt Murray play NHL games this season?
Kyle, I'm gonna say yes. Yeah, I'm gonna go out on a limb and say yes. And I think that's a great point that you made. Could definitely be used as a mentor, I think for sure, especially when considering the goalies that they're gonna have in the Marley system this year. You mentioned Hildeby for one. But I'm gonna go ahead and say yes. And I think it's just for the reasons that if you go back to Joseph Wall and Anthony Stolarz, for example, um, they haven't exactly been able to maintain, a full NHL season worth, for each of them. They haven't been able to. So I think that if you have a good third option, if he can really establish himself, even if it is like with the Marlies, and you have a Matt Murray who can maybe play a Martin Jones type role that was last year, as I mentioned, where Samsonov and Wall, there was issues last year. Goaltending was a problem and it needed to be addressed in the offseason this year. I think if Matt Murray can prove that he's capable of doing those types of things, and we don't know how many games either that Joseph Wall and Stolarz are going to play. I mean, both coming off of career years, considering their numbers, is they're coming off of career years technically, and so if Matt Murray can come in, and if something were to happen, I think that he would be the guy, the go-to guy, if he can establish himself, like you said, and just so that you could keep those younger guys developing with the Marlies, and then you have Murray who, as you mentioned, he has a long resume and a respectable one at that. So I'm gonna say yes.
Evan, you're one of the great up and comers in the space. Thanks for jumping on the show today and let everybody know where we can find your work and plug anything if you've got anything as well.
Yeah, no, just the Hockey News, Toronto, the website thn.com/Toronto, and Kyle, thanks for bringing me on today. It was awesome.
Thanks again to Evan for joining the show, and be sure to follow him on Twitter as well and help support a young kid getting started in this space. That's going to do it for today's episode. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll be back tomorrow for a great edition of Camp Countdown. You don't want to miss tomorrow's. We'll see you then.